Hi, this week we're going to be wrapping up the economic history of the antebellum era, and then we'll shift to the political history. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about manufacturing, which I think is what most people think of when they think about the economic revolutions of the 19th century. A few things to keep in mind, which is that when we think of manufacturing, we tend to think of factories and high tech, or at the very least, the kind of heavy industry that would come to be dominant in the late 19th century. The early 19th century, never mind the late 18th century, manufacturing began with very small scale production, much of it taking place among farm families working during the winter months to, for example, put together goods like shoes or straw hats or weaving textiles. And they did this at home. So it was it was known as the putting out system, where they placed the semi-manufactured goods with families to do. Likewise, tailors, blacksmiths, and others might have started to produce things that went into a larger industrial economy. But those are all very small scale and they're very decentralized. By contrast, what we think of like factories really begin at this period, but are not the dominant form. So take a look at this. This is the Slater Mills in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which are water-powered mills. This is arguably the first American textile mill, founded in 1790. And it borrowed designs from British water-powered spinning machines. If you'll recall, we talked about the South and cotton. The British had already industrialized and had begun to produce and mass produce, this is the key part, textiles in factories before the United States. But this was the first in the US. Appropriately enough, it was the brainchild of an English immigrant who had built the spinning machines that he had memorized in his own mind and then recreated them here. This was something that the British actually were deeply fearful of long before our 21st century concerns about technology transfer taking place, say from the United States to China. In this earlier period, it was England fearful of losing its technological innovations to the United States. It's precisely what happened here. This was a factory founded with pirated designs. The way that the factories worked was that the entrepreneurs running it were doing so by hiring entire families to work within its walls. This is a modern day photograph of it. It's a historic site today. It allowed the manufacturers to access to cheap labor because they would have children working, wives, husbands, everyone, would be there in one place, not paid particularly great wages, and many of the people obviously working there might be immigrants. If you then look, though, to some of the innovations that Slater was introducing, you begin to see the more sophisticated kind of large-scale industries that are going to, large-scale factories that are ultimately going to take the place of the earliest Slater mills. And these are going to burst on the scene a little later with the advent of the Boston Manufacturing Company outside of Boston, in a place called Waltham. This was the first really large corporation chartered to produce textiles. It was capitalized at 10 times the size of the Slater mills. And you can see here the factory on the left. I think I've got a close up. Here we go. And this was this was a consortium of Boston merchants who had accumulated a lot of surplus capital in the course of conducting trade and wanted to invest it somewhere and decided that this was a good place to invest it. And unlike the Slater mills, which still had kind of connections to some of the home putting out system of decentralized production. This was genuinely a truly centralized operation. This was the first real kind of modern factory meant to produce textiles built in the United States. It was run not by the people who had capitalized it, but actually run by managers, foremen. So you had this separation of ownership and management, which is one of the kind of hallmarks of modern enterprise. And workers got paid either by the piece, that is, say, how much they did, or by the hour. Either way, though, the efficiencies and economies of scale that you saw in this particular factory allowed for the production of incredibly inexpensive cloth. And for many women who up until this time might have woven their own cloth, made from wool, this marked the beginnings of mass-produced textiles that replaced home production. The success of this experiment would ultimately inspire what is considered the kind of greatest industrial undertakings of the antebellum era, which also took place in Massachusetts in a town called Lowell. And Lowell was effectively built from scratch. It was named after Francis Cabot Lowell, the merchant who had capitalized or helped capitalize the first factory we talked about. And unlike this single factory, Lowell was a consortia of factories. You can see it here, in which mills, you can see them lining the Merrimack River there at the top of the screen. Lawrence Mills, Merrimack Mills, Boot Mills, Hamilton Mills lower down, Appleton Mills. There's a bunch of different companies that come together. And so this is really the first good example of a kind of single industry dominated city. It's grown up, and in many ways it's the model in more ways than one for some of the industrial cities or company towns that you see in China today. It's not a model in the sense that the Chinese deliberately have emulated this, but it shares many qualities in common. So first, where do the workers come from? In this particular instance, the mill owners decided that they would hire young women from the New England countryside, persuading fathers to let their daughters come work for a few years temporarily before getting married. And this would allow them to build up some savings. It would get them out from underneath the parents' house. And it would have the additional benefit for American factory owners of not creating a permanent working class. So in the UK, in Great Britain, something very different had taken place, where the British had these, places like Birmingham and Manchester, huge industrial cities that had tremendously impoverished citizens working in factories. This was a little different. This was going to be these women, single, who would live in dormitories and be monitored by overseers to ensure that they would not get into trouble. And sometimes that didn't work out that way. It was a system that was like, if you can imagine going off to college and living in the dorms, it's a very comparable system with just a lot more moral oversight for the workers, the women. So you can see here, Lowell, Massachusetts, around 1840. Charles Dickens, the famous English novelist, came and visited here and talked about how Lowell seemed as though it had been built yesterday. And for those, in many ways, that was true. It was an instant city created for one purpose and one purpose only, manufacturing and textiles in particular. As a company town, while the women were obviously the key workers, the real star of the show were the machines, because it was here that you really begin to see increasingly sophisticated machinery, much of it originally pirated from the British, but now with new improvements introduced. Bobbins and spindles shown here were the things that drew the thread through and allowed the women to, without actually doing the weaving, run the machine so that it would achieve its ends. So here we are in 1850, a mere 10 years later, and what do we have here? We have a mill girl. By the 1840s, the competition that was starting to dominate and define the mills increasingly drove factory owners to consider ways to get labor for less money. And it was in the 1840s that several things came together that kind of destroyed that very early idyllic and frankly utopian interlude where it was these women from the countryside. The issue was the influx of Irish immigrants as well as other immigrants who could be hired to work even more cheaply than New England farm girls. And among those immigrants, you could hire young girls, or in some cases boys, to work in child labor was even less expensive. The kind of mill workers that you saw then by the eve of the Civil War were overwhelmingly immigrants, children, and otherwise cheap labor that constituted a permanent working class now in these mill towns. And if you go up to the north today, many of these mill towns, even though they no longer have the factories operational, still have these communities that draw their roots back to this initial settlement that began really in earnest in the 1840s. All right, so let's take a look here at the growth of cotton textile manufacturing, because I should emphasize it's cotton overwhelmingly that's being spun in these mills, although occasionally you'll have woolens as well. So you can see here, there are initial, like, very kind of tentative attempts in the South to have mills, but the labor regime is not really suitable for industrial labor. Slaves who are fighting back against masters can do a lot more damage in a mill than they can on a plantation. By contrast, obviously you see that the spread of textile manufacturing is really overwhelmingly concentrated in the North, and in particular, Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And if you're asking yourself, why there? Why were those particular places so well suited? It wasn't just about the workforce. It wasn't just about the surplus capital that the New England, Boston Brahmins brought to bear. It was about water, because these are all water-powered mills. It's hard to imagine today, and they weren't doing this because they were trying to be green. They were doing it because this was a very simple way of powering these mills, and the gigantic water wheels would turn, turning all of these spindles, or they would transfer power along these iron rods that would then turn. In fact, if you go back to one of the images I showed you from Samuel Slater's book, you'll see those, the mechanism by which the power is transferred from the water wheel to the actual spinning machines and the things that actually do the weaving. So here you can see a kind of more colorful image again, and underscoring that geography is sometimes destiny insofar as where these are concentrated. Keep in mind too, like, look at that purple dot, the really big one. That's 250 to 500,000 spindles. A spindle is a way of measuring textile production. This is, a single one of those dots is basically equivalent to everything in the South. All right, so it's overwhelmingly concentrated in the North. This is a somewhat misleading graphical representation if you actually represent it at the scale. Okay. A few other points. If you look at manufacturing, even though towns like Lowell and the mills that are all around Rhode Island and Massachusetts get a lot of the publicity and kind of stand out as icons of the Industrial Revolution, it's worth pointing out that a significant number of women who are working as wage laborers, that is to say they're selling their labor on the open market, are not necessarily doing it in textiles, but are doing it in making things like palm hats and straw bonnets, which is overwhelmingly something that's still concentrated in home production. Boots and shoes is another area. Lynn, Massachusetts, city north of Boston, is the center of shoe production in the United States. But it just goes to show you that this is a very slow moving process where an older form of production that is proto-industrial is now starting to be supplanted gradually by what we would describe as more modern, factory-focused industry.